"So, you're basically placing a gag order on me," she clarified. "If that is how you wish to perceive it, then so be it." He reached down to retrieve her phone, a clear indicator he considered the conversation closed, and glanced at the screen before handing it over. "This isn't exactly what I would call professional behavior," he said. Nodding down at the ridiculous pouting picture of her on the screen, embarrassed, she cast her eyes down, hating to feel so completely wrong-footed. It was meant to be ironic. She attempted to explain even while she knew he would never understand the intended humor behind the picture. "I trust you will conduct yourself appropriately at this meeting?" Damn it. So much for trying to impress the man with her professionalism and ability to do the job. She tried her best to keep her reply humble. "Yes, sir. I apologize if my earlier lack of professionalism caused you to think otherwise, sir," she said in her best no-nonsense voice, although she couldn't quite disguise the sarcasm dripping all over that last word. He raised his eyebrows, indicating he hadn't missed the acerbity, then raked her body from top to toe with his gaze. "You might want to run a comb through your hair," he said, the words dripping with disdain. "Maybe reapply your lipstick while you're at it. Oh, and I'm sure you'd like to adjust your skirt and button your blouse before we get there as well." Bastard. She scooted back to her end of the seat and quickly straightened her skirt and fumblingly fixed her blouse, flushing a little when she noticed her bra was showing. A quick check of her hair and makeup confirmed the former was sticking up a bit and her lipstick was smudged at one corner of her mouth. Wait, how on earth had she managed to smudge her lipstick while trying to pick up her phone? Who did that? This day just got worse and worse and it wasn't even 8 o'clock yet. She reapplied it and quite pointedly turned her back on him to stare out the window. She wasn't going to let him dampen her excitement of being here, and if this was all she got to see of the city, then she was damned well going to soak it in while she could. She heard him snort softly behind her but ignored it, willing him to go back to his oh-so-critical preparation. He only needed her here to take notes, write his correspondence, and do all the other menial crap that required little to no thinking. She knew Donna, his executive assistant, had a very challenging and intellectually stimulating job. She handled projects, ran the office in his absence, and had all manner of other important and interesting duties. But Dante didn't trust Cleo to do even a small percentage of what his precious Donna did. And she didn't expect him to. She was nowhere near as qualified. He gave her the basic secretarial stuff to do while designating the more important tasks to other personal and executive assistants. The little he did entrust to her was always gone over by the man himself with a fine-tooth comb. Naturally, the other assistants were already swamped with their own regular duties and were starting to resent Cleo for not doing the job she was being so handsomely paid for. They knew Luke and Dante were friends because Cleo had foolishly mentioned it to one of the younger admin assistants in an aborted attempt to make friends. The woman had wasted no time spreading rumors that Cleo had been hired because of the relationship between the two men. Nobody would ever accuse Dante of nepotism to his face, of course, so Cleo bore the brunt of their hostility. After that, Cleo had been a lot pickier about whom she spoke to at work. Luckily, there were a number of other people who didn't give the rumors any credence. People like Florence, the lovely tea lady, Solomon, the cheerful company driver, Dante's personal protection guys, and some of the junior staff members who didn't get saddled with her extra work. Despite the short time she'd been working there, she had no shortage of new friends. But the irony was that Cleo hadn't for even a second realized the Dante Damaso of Damaso International Incorporated was the same Dan whose name Luke casually dropped into conversation on occasion. Luke and Dante had met in college and had become friends, but were hardly the type of guys to invite each other to family gatherings, so Cleo had never had the opportunity to meet the man. She had also been way too involved with her own life and her dancing, too wrapped up in herself, to care about Lucius and his boring friends. So it had come as a shock to learn Luke's Dan was the Dante Damaso of the renowned Damaso International chain of 5-star hotels and resorts. Only after Luke had gone all stern and disapproving big brother on her for using his relationship with Dante to get a job, did the penny drop. That's when she'd understood that she'd probably gotten the job because she was Luke's sister. a favor neither Luke nor Cleo had actually asked for. By that time it had been too late to back out, and Cleo had been determined to make the best of the chance she'd been given. Of course, if she had actually met Dante Damaso during the interview process, she may very well have told him to shove his job. But his minions had conducted the recorded interviews, and Dante had, supposedly, made his decision after watching the recordings. Cleo didn't know what she'd expected of Dante Damaso. But from the very first day he had made it clear he merely suffered her presence, and just half an hour into her first day, after asking her to make him a cup of coffee, photocopy some documents, send 2 emails, one of which she had messed up by leaving off a 0 in a seriously huge number, and water his frickin' ficus, he had sent her downstairs to a junior executive. Once there, the junior exec's assistant had patronizingly ushered Cleo to a desk and instructed her to answer the phone if it rang, before the woman checked her makeup. And swanned off with a breezy "Mr. Damaso needs me to assist him today." The memory still made Cleo seethe, 4 months later, and she clenched her teeth when she thought of how consistently after that first encounter the same thing had happened. She began every day in Damaso's office suite, and after half an hour, during which she had the dubious privilege of making his coffee and watering that stupid ficus, or sometimes sending one of those loathsome little thanks for the sex notes, she got shipped off to a different exec. Luckily the other executives had stopped giving her mundane tasks to do, and she'd started enjoying her daily little soirees away from the boss's office. Still, the half hours in the mornings had become almost unbearable. Dante was scathing, brutally frank in his dismissal of her skills, and almost unbearably rude. He never greeted her, never used common courtesies like please and thank you when he spoke with her, and Cleo was convinced a smile would crack his perfect face. Dante was still grimly focused on his iPad, and Cleo went back to greedily watching the passing scenery, trying to commit as much of it to memory as she could while longing to be out there exploring the wonderful mix of old and new. She loved the wooden buildings that looked as if they'd been around since the Middle Ages, tucked away down alleys and overshadowed by aggressively modern monolithic skyscrapers. Nothing escaped her attention, and she tried to file away the interesting bits, wanting to research and read up on buildings, museums, and shops that captured her interest. All of which helped keep her mind off Dante's disturbing presence. Chapter 2, Praise Jesus. They had donuts. Cleo barely noticed all the bowing and talking around her as her senses homed in on that single, all-important fact. By now she was so hungry she actually felt faint. And if she could only get her hands on one of those gorgeous hoops of sugary goodness, all would be right with her world. She nodded dazedly at the half-circle of somber-looking businessmen in dark suits bowing to her and was barely aware of the tall, dark presence looming beside her as her eyes drifted again and again to the tempting display of coffee and pastries set up over to the side. The painfully prolonged polite greetings finally over, she stealthily drifted over to the table of goodies. She was just a finger's length away from a chocolate-glazed precious with her name written all over it when a firm hand clamped down on her elbow. Her empty stomach sank to the bottom of her sensible shoes, and she stared up at her boss with what she knew was the most effectively pathetic hangdog expression in her arsenal. But he was having none of it. His jaw was clenched so tightly she was amazed his teeth didn't crack. She gave one final forlorn look at the donuts before he led her to the long conference table in the center of the room. "Try to pay attention," he muttered in her ear as he planted her into a seat that, cruelly, faced the delicious spread just a table's breadth away from her. What followed was the longest, most boring and torturous 3 hours of Cleo's life. The meeting was conducted entirely in Japanese, which Cleo didn't speak but Dante most certainly did, and quite fluently too from what she could tell. She didn't know why she was there. He had a dictaphone recording the meeting, so even if she'd been able to understand what was going on, she wouldn't have had to take notes anyway. All she could do was stare at the donuts and other delicious goodies in front of her and imagine how they tasted. At one point a fly landed on her donut. It took everything she had not to jump up with a primal scream and chase it away. Instead, she watched in revulsion as it crawled over every inch of her beautiful donut. She nearly sobbed in disappointment. Gave up on the chocolate one, and shifted her attention to a gorgeous eclair on a different platter. But when that bastard fly, which she had now named Damaso Jr., landed on her eclair as well, she slumped back in her chair and stared glumly down at the blank notebook in front of her. She picked up her pen and started scribbling. Hoping to at least look busy, she composed truly awful haiku and observations about the people seated around the table. Her attempt at describing Dante, hard of abs he is, beautiful to look at sure, my god what a dick, okay. Maybe that last line was a little ambiguous. Was it an insult or a compliment? Even Cleo wasn't sure, after several even worse attempts. Cleo gave up on the haiku. She segued into doodling, occasionally looking up and nodding to make it seem like she was listening to every incomprehensible word being spoken. She glanced over at Dante and was delighted to note that he'd perched his dark-rimmed spectacles on the tip of his nose. She'd seen them before, of course, but loved how truly nerdy they made him look. Sexy nerdy, but it was a flaw and she'd take it. The only other woman present, Ms. Inakawa, also slanted surreptitious glances at Dante and smiled demurely every time he spoke with her. If not for the calculating gleam in her pretty eyes, Cleo would have thought the woman sweet and slightly shy, but beneath all that saccharine sweetness beat the heart of a scheming seductress. And she had her sights on Dante. Well, she was welcome to him. All Cleo wanted was a donut. Maybe that caramel one. It looked like the fly had skipped, damn it. Sure enough, as if drawn to it by her thoughts, the fly landed on that one too. By the time the meeting was over, the damned thing would have, Miss Knight? She jerked upright, realizing Dante had been trying to get her attention. Yes? I asked if you got that? That? What? Wait, had they finally said something in English and she'd missed it? Yes. Yes, I did. She tapped the page of her open notebook as if to confirm her words, and when his eyes followed the movement, she hastily closed the book, not wanting him to see her scribbles. His brow lifted and his head tilted as his eyes burned into hers, and she smiled breezily up at him. She'd just check his dictaphone later to figure out what it was she'd missed. No problem, well? He asked. Crap. Now what? Yes, I got it, she repeated slowly, as if to an inattentive child. His eyes narrowed dangerously. God, he was scary when he did that. Okay, so maybe this was something he wanted done right away. That wasn't good at all. She'd have to cop to the truth. She leaned in toward him and was a little offended when he leaned in the opposite direction. I didn't quite get the last bit, she confessed, and his eyes flared with what looked like disgust. How was she supposed to know they'd suddenly switched to English? Okay, so she should probably have been paying closer attention, but after 3 hours of nothing but Japanese, she was bound to have zoned out at some point. I want you to arrange a meeting with Craig, Josh, Ryan, Tanaka-san, Inakawa-san, Watanabe-san, and myself for 3:30 this afternoon. Cleo ducked her head as she quickly scribbled the information on a blank sheet in her notebook. You may use this conference room for the meeting, Knight-san, Ms. Inakawa said in her breathy little voice, shocking the hell out of Cleo with her English. Could they all speak English? If so, how rude of them to not once acknowledge her lack of Japanese. Then again, she was just the assistant, who couldn't even do the only thing that had been required of her at this meeting efficiently. The meeting was apparently adjourned, because the men bowed and shook hands. Ms. Inakawa was speaking in that charmingly girlish voice, all the while smiling sweetly, while Cleo was left to her own devices, alone at the table. She got up, ostensibly to stretch, and finally made her way over to the fly-tainted, stale-looking pastries. Knight, get on those phone calls, Dante growled from the other end of the room. Cleo swallowed down her resentment before fishing out the company phone to contact the architect, the contractor, and Ryan Blake, the company's legal representative, all of whom were staying at the same hotel as Cleo and Dante. After a series of meetings with the three men the previous day, the boss had wanted to meet with the Japanese alone this morning in order to straighten out the mess he believed the other men had created. So if he was calling them back in, it must mean he'd made some headway in that morning's meeting. The speed at which they all answered their phones attested to the fact that they'd probably been anxiously awaiting her call. And Cleo set up the meeting within minutes. Dante was still amicably chatting with the Japanese trio, but the moment she disconnected the second call, he looked at her with a raised brow. She nodded in response to the question she could see in his eyes, and he went back to his conversation without acknowledging her affirmation. Stifling her irritation at his rudeness, she started compiling a list of all the documentation they would need for the second meeting. She was well engrossed in that task when Dante's voice, coming from directly behind her, startled her back into the present. "Are you coming?" "Inakawa-san has arranged lunch for us," he informed her, and Cleo bit back a groan of relief. She jumped up quickly before he could revoke the invitation, and swayed slightly as the lack of food and jet lag hit her. His hand caught her elbow and steadied her. "What's going on with you?" He hissed. "I haven't eaten much of anything since the in-flight meal yesterday morning," she hissed back. "So excuse me for feeling a little lightheaded." "Nonsense. You had dinner last night and breakfast this morning." He waved his hand dismissively, refuting her claims with innate arrogance. "No, you had dinner and breakfast. You told me we'd have a dinner meeting and ordered only enough for yourself, and if you consider that one piece of bacon and mouthful of eggs I gobbled down this morning breakfast, then you and I have seriously different ideas of what constitutes a healthy meal." His brow lowered as he considered her words, then he tilted his head toward the pastries on the nearby table. "And this is why you've been staring at that table like an addict eyeing her next fix?" "Okay, is that a glint of laughter in his normally enigmatic gaze?" "That was different. I'm starving," she said flatly, unamused by his amusement. "We'll remedy that immediately," he assured her, squeezing her elbow briefly before letting her go completely. Cleo tried not to cry while she stared down at the minuscule serving of sushi in front of her. Ms. Inakawa had reserved a trendy sushi restaurant for lunch, and though Cleo wasn't a huge fan of Japanese food, she'd eat it if she was desperate enough. However, she hadn't been expecting a child-sized portion of food. She wasn't the biggest of women, dancing kept her lean, and her frame was ideally petite for a dancer, but she had a healthy appetite, and the prettily decorated plate in front of her barely contained enough food to feed a gnat. She was about to dig in when a hand clamped down on her thigh and squeezed painfully. Her shocked gaze flew to Dante's impassive face, and he turned his head to glare at her before nodding toward Mr. Watanabe, who was speaking. She belatedly recalled the cultural etiquette booklet she had speedily read through on the plane, and remembered eating or drinking before your hosts was considered extremely rude. Apparently Mr. Watanabe was going to ramble on for a while before giving the go-ahead to eat. She stared at her sushi glumly and took solace in the fact that at least it wouldn't get cold, and her little friend Damaso Jr. was probably still back in that stuffy boardroom gorging himself on stale donuts and eclairs and therefore unable to ruin this meal for her. Mr. Watanabe finally stopped talking, and everybody picked up his or her chopsticks and proceeded to eat with great gusto. "Damaso-san, you use chopsticks very proficiently," Cleo heard Ms. Inakawa, seated on Dante's left, say in her breathy voice. Seriously? Like the man wasn't arrogant enough, she was going to stare at him with those big brown eyes and fawn over him because he could use chopsticks? He modestly thanked her for her compliment. And Cleo choked down her sushi, trying very hard not to be sick. A few minutes later she nearly was sick when she stared in horror at the plate of sashimi that had just been placed in front of her. Her hand fluttered to her mouth as she swallowed back her nausea. "Don't you dare," Dante warned, leaning toward her and keeping a pleasant smile on his face to disguise the warning. "But they're alive," she practically wept in reply. The sashimi shrimp on her plate were writhing weakly and had quite effectively killed her previously ravenous appetite. "You don't like Odoriabe, Knight-san?" Mr. Tanaka, who had been chatting shyly with her in broken English, noticed her reaction. "It's very fresh." "It's not fresh," she said from behind her hand. "It's alive." "Yes." Mr. Tanaka nodded, smiling encouragingly as he made an eager go-ahead gesture with his hands. "Fresh. Taste. Taste. I don't think." She was on the verge of tears, horrified at the thought of the shrimp dying in her mouth. It was hypocritical, sure, but if they'd died even just seconds before being served to her, she would happily have eaten them. But the thought of them dying between her teeth or on her tongue or as they slid down her throat totally grossed her out. She turned pleading eyes on Dante, whose face was completely expressionless. "I can't." He turned to their companions, said something in Japanese, and they all roared with laughter. "Oh, Damaso-san, you are so funny," Ms. Inakawa chortled. "Yeah. Hilarious," Cleo muttered beneath her breath. A slanted glance from him confirmed that he'd heard her. She directed another distressed look down at her plate, and a pair of chopsticks swooped into her line of vision and grabbed one of the poor creatures. "Don't worry, Miss Knight, I'll save you from these creepy crustaceans," he mocked, before dipping the poor thing in soy sauce, hopefully drowning it, and popping it into his mouth. "You're just prolonging their suffering by letting them writhe like that." She was ridiculously grateful to him for handling the situation even though he had made her the butt of the joke to do so. The incident was soon forgotten, but as the dishes grew progressively more unappetizing, sea urchin, her queasiness and exhaustion made her feel more ill with every passing moment. Lunch stretched on for ages, and when it finally ended, Cleo, who had barely touched a morsel, had a huge headache and felt a little punch-drunk. "Miss Knight, contact the driver and head back to the hotel to draft those emails we discussed earlier," Dante said as the group got up from the booth. She stared up at him blankly, wondering what she'd missed this time. He waved the other three ahead of them. And Cleo tried to focus on his face and what he was saying, which was difficult when she felt like a zombie. "I'm sorry, I don't recall the emails you're referring to," she said, hating to reinforce his already low opinion of her. "There are no emails, Knight. Go back to the hotel, take a shower, order room service, and get some sleep." The jet lag, combined with the busy evening and, his eyes darkened and his voice lowered sexily, exhausting night you had yesterday, has taken a toll on you. Rest up. I need you to be more alert tomorrow. "Oh, thank God, thank you, sir," she whispered, for once feeling something akin to affection and gratitude toward the man. "Go on now, Knight," he said, the words brusque and the tone businesslike. "Before I change my mind." She resisted the impish urge to salute, and after he'd followed the other three people out onto the humid, bustling sidewalk, she got out her cell phone to contact the driver. Half an hour later, she was back in the air-conditioned splendor of the car and happily chatting with the driver, Daisuke. He spoke fluent English and very sweetly pointed out a few of the interesting sights to her, giving her a brief history lesson while he was at it. Cleo was disappointed when they arrived back at the hotel. She was tempted to venture out on her own, since she had this unexpected free time, but hunger and exhaustion had really taken their toll on her, and by the time she got back to her room, she was dragging so badly that eating didn't even occur to her. She discarded her clothes on her way to the bed and fell face down onto the covers. She was asleep seconds later, Miss Knight? The regrettably familiar masculine voice resonated through Cleo's pleasant dream. She frowned and turned away from it, happily rejoining the cotton candy sheep she'd been frolicking with just moments before. The sheep were cute, friendly, and delicious. She took a bite out of a particularly friendly fellow's sugary pink fleece and relished the sweetness. The sheep bawed and Miss Knight.